She buried her father alone. No neighbors, no church, no one. Just cold mud, a borrowed shovel, and a stranger on a gray horse watching from the tree line. 3 days later, that stranger offered to pay every debt she owed in exchange for one thing: her name. She had $3 in her pocket, and 30 days before she lost everything her father died trying to save. So she signed. What she did not know was that Colt Hargrove had not come to Blackwater Valley to ranch. He had come for revenge, and she had just walked into the middle of it. Here on this channel, we tell stories of the American West, stories of love forged in hard country, of loyalty tested by fire, of the quiet courage it takes to build something worth keeping when everything is trying to tear it down. Sometimes, the contract you sign out of desperation becomes the life you would have chosen anyway. If only you had been brave enough to choose it. If that kind of story speaks to you, stay with us. Like this video? Leave a comment telling us what brought you here, share it with someone who loves a good Western, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. We will be here every week with a new story worth your time.
They said Colt Hargrove had killed 9 men. The real number was 11, and I learned that on the morning I became his wife. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where things actually began, which was not at the altar, and not in the judge's front room, and not even on the day I received the offer. Let me start in the mud in November with a borrowed shovel and a pine box and nobody else for miles. My father's name was Edmund Cross. He was not a large man or a loud one. He had a farmer's hands and a reader's eyes and the particular stubbornness of someone who believes that if you simply work hard enough and long enough, the land will eventually meet you halfway. He was wrong about that, as it turned out. The land in Blackwater Valley did not meet anyone halfway. Neither did the Ashford Land Syndicate, which had been buying up property across the territory for 3 years by the time it turned its attention to my father's 160 acres. He died on a Wednesday in November. The doctor said heart failure. I was not so sure. 6 months of letters from the syndicate's lawyers, 6 months of his mortgage being quietly purchased and held over him, 6 months of watching everything he had built begin to slip. And then one Wednesday he was gone, and I was left with the debt and the land and the knowledge that both would be taken from me within 30 days. I buried him alone. Not because I had no neighbors. I had neighbors. I had the Hendersons 2 miles east and the Pattersons down the valley road and a dozen families I had known my whole life. But the Ashford Syndicate's reach was longer than their sympathy, and nobody came. The church sent no one. The town sent no one. I dug in cold, wet ground with a borrowed shovel while the sky went the color of old pewter above me, and I talked to him while I worked because the silence was too large otherwise. I said, "You taught me to finish what I start, Papa, so I am finishing this." My hands blistered on the shovel handle. The sound of dirt hitting wood is something I have never been able to unhear. A hawk circled overhead, riding the cold air in slow, patient loops, and I thought, at least something is watching. When I was nearly done, I looked up and saw him. A man on a gray horse at the edge of the tree line. Far enough to be respectful. Close enough to be deliberate. Dark coat, hat pulled low, one hand resting easy on the saddle horn. He was not moving, and he was not leaving. He was simply there, watching, in the way of someone who felt he owed a witness to a dead man he had never met. I straightened and looked directly at him across the distance. He did not look away. We regarded each other for a long moment across my father's grave, this stranger and I. And then he turned his gray horse and rode into the trees, and was gone. I did not know his name. I filed him away the way my father taught me to file things that did not make sense yet, and I went back to finishing what I had started. 3 days later, a lawyer arrived at my door with soft hands and nervous eyes and an offer from a Mr. Colt Hargrove of Hargrove Ranch, 30,000 acres, Western Valley. Mr. Hargrove was prepared to purchase the full outstanding debt on the Cross property, $2,400, and transfer clear title back to Elena Cross. In exchange, marriage. Legal and binding, her choice to make in the next 24 hours. I read the contract twice. The terms were cleaner than I expected. My land stayed in my name, held in trust under the arrangement. Separate rooms, no obligations stated beyond the legal marriage itself. The debt erased. I thought about the $3.18 in my coat pocket. I thought about the foreclosure notice tacked to the barn door. I thought about the man on the gray horse who had stood at my father's grave, like he was paying a debt to someone who could no longer collect it. I signed. The wedding took place in Judge Harold Fenner's front room, which smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, and the particular mustiness of a man who had been signing documents in the same chair for 30 years. The judge read the words the way you read a livestock manifest. His wife stood near the window with her arms folded, and her opinion of the entire proceedings written plainly on her face. Ruth Calloway stood witness on the groom's side. I would learn later that Ruth had been running Hargrove Ranch for 6 years, and considered it her house in every way that mattered. That morning she looked me over from boots to braid without a word, and I decided then that Ruth Calloway's opinion was one worth earning. I saw Colt Hargrove for the second time when I walked into that room. He was taller than I had expected. Everything he wore was black, shirt and vest and trousers, and the leather gloves he had not removed. A scar ran from his jaw to his collar in a way that suggested someone had once tried very hard to do him serious harm. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that made him look younger than I had estimated. But his eyes were older than the rest of him, old in a way that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with what those years had contained. When the judge asked, "Do you?" Colt turned and looked at me directly for the first time. I had been bracing for something hard in his expression. Judgment or cold calculation, or the particular contempt of a man who has purchased something and is assessing its value. What I saw instead was exhaustion. The specific bone-deep tiredness of a person who has been fighting something for so long they have forgotten what they were fighting toward. I said I do. It came out steadier than I felt. No ring, no kiss. We walked out into the cold together, and he helped me into the wagon with one gloved hand, brief and careful, and let go the moment I was settled. Hargrove Ranch appeared as we crested the last ridge, and I made myself look at it honestly rather than with either hope or dread. It was large, built from logs and stone with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. The outbuildings were solid and well-maintained. Fences ran farther than the eye could follow. Everything about it said, "Someone built this to last." It also said, "Someone has been very quiet here for a very long time." Ruth met us on the porch. She looked at me the same way she had in the judge's front room, measuring and direct, and then she opened the door without a word. And I understood this was as close to welcome as I would get tonight, and that it was enough. Inside, solid furniture. Nothing wasted, nothing frivolous. The smell of coffee and beeswax and bread baked hours ago. Ruth led me upstairs without being asked. The room was simple and clean. An iron bed with a handmade quilt, a washstand, a window that looked west over the valley, the mountains going purple in the failing light. Colt set my carpet bag on the bed. He said, "Lock works," nodding at the door. I don't make a habit of going where I'm not invited. He picked up my bag and set it down again, a gesture without purpose. The movement of a man who does not know what to do with his hands in a situation that has no protocol. He turned to leave. I said, "Mr. Hargrove." He stopped. I said, "Why were you at my father's burial?" The silence that followed was 2 full seconds long enough to be its own kind of answer. He said, "Get some sleep, Mrs. Hargrove. Morning comes early." He walked to the far end of the hall. A door opened and closed. I stood alone in the lamplight and looked at the lock on the door and thought about a man who stands witness at the grave of someone he has never met, and then offers to pay that dead man's debts, and then tells his new wife the lock works on the first night of their marriage. I did not lock the door. I did not sleep. I was in the kitchen before Colt. This was habit from my father's farm, where the day began before the sun did or it did not begin at all. I found the coffee and found the stove, and had both going by the time I heard his boots on the stairs. He stopped in the doorway, took in the scene without speaking, sat at the table. I set a cup in front of him without asking. He looked at it, then at me, then picked it up. We drank coffee in silence for 10 minutes, and it was the least uncomfortable silence I had experienced since before my father died. This surprised me enough that I filed it away carefully. After breakfast, I told him I was riding out to survey the eastern property line. My land, held in trust under our contract, and I needed to see what I was working with. He said no, not a request. A flat statement delivered without looking up from the map he was studying. I said, "That is my land." He said, "Your land shares a border with Ashford's new acquisition. He bought the eastern tract 6 weeks ago, and his surveyors have been on the line every day since." I said, "Then I should know what they are looking at." He said, "You should stay inside the fence until I know what they are planning." I said, "Mr. Hargrove, I did not sign a contract to be kept indoors." And he looked up at me for the first time since sitting down. Something moved behind his eyes, something measuring. Then he said, "Fine, I ride with you." I said, "I did not ask for company." He said, "No, you did not." He rode with me anyway. I let it go because I am practical and because I had not yet calibrated the full dimensions of this man. And until I had, keeping him where I could see him seemed wiser than pushing him to a distance. The eastern fence line was 2 hours out. The land between was the kind of country that made you understand why people crossed a continent to reach it. Vast rolling grass under a sky so large it had no ceiling. The mountains blue and permanent in the west. Colt rode without speaking, which I was coming to understand was simply how he moved through the world, rather than any particular hostility. He pointed out things as we rode, the survey markers along the creek, the way the grass changed color where the soil quality shifted, a section of fence post that had been disturbed and reset at a slightly different angle than the original line. He said, "They move them at night, a foot or two at a time. By the time anyone notices, the legal line is 50 feet from where it started." I said, "Has he done this before, in other parts of the valley?" He said, "The Morrow property lost 40 acres this way before Dan Morrow realized what was happening." By then, the paperwork supported Ashford's version of the line. I was about to ask more when we saw the rider, one of Ashford's outriders crossing onto Hargrove property at an easy walk, casual, deliberate. The kind of trespass that is not careless but communicates something specific. We go where we choose, and no one stops us. The man was large and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had not been told no by anyone worth listening to. He looked at me with the particular contempt reserved for women who appear in places men consider their own. Colt stepped his horse forward, just one step. He did not reach for his gun. He did not raise his voice. He looked at the man with an expression I spent a long time afterward trying to describe accurately. And the best I could manage was this: the face of someone who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the other person to understand what it is. Colt said, "You are on my land." The outrider held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned his horse and rode back across the fence line without a word. I watched this. I understood something that no story told secondhand could have conveyed. The reason an entire valley stepped aside when Colt Hargrove rode through was not the gun or the reputation or the 11 men. It was the absolute certainty in his eyes that the outcome had already been determined and he was simply being patient about it. I filed this away. I was filing many things. Back at the ranch, passing the open door of his study, I saw the desk. Maps and ledgers and a rifle mounted on the wall, and in the corner of the desk a photograph placed face down, not fallen or forgotten, turned over with intention. I did not touch it. I looked at it for a moment longer than I should have. When I looked up, Ruth was in the hallway watching me. She said, "Don't. Not unkind, just clear." I walked on, but I thought about that face-down photograph for the rest of the day, wondering what a person hides from themselves and why, and what it costs to keep doing it. After supper, washing dishes, Ruth spoke without preamble. She said, "He had a wife before." I said, I gathered. She said, Margaret. She left 3 years ago. I said, why? Ruth was quiet for the length of time it takes to wash one plate thoroughly. Then she said, she told him she could not live with a man who carried darkness the way other men carry a coat. Said she kept waiting for him to put it down and he never did. I said, and he let her go. Ruth said, he does not keep things that do not want to stay. I said, does he think that is a virtue? Ruth looked at me sideways. She said, he thinks it is the only decent thing he has done in a long time. I dried plates and thought about that. About a man who watches someone leave and calls it decency. About what kind of damage produces that particular conclusion. That night I lay awake listening to the ranch settle. His boots on the floorboards, slow and measured. They stopped outside my door for a moment, then moved on to the far end of the hall. I stared at the ceiling. I was not afraid of him. This was the fact that surprised me most about this place, this arrangement, this man at the end of the hall. I had come here braced for something I needed to survive. Instead, I found myself in a house that felt, against all reason, like somewhere I might actually want to be. I did not know yet whether that was wisdom or the most dangerous thing about me. 2 weeks in, I had found the rhythm of Hargrove Ranch. Pre-dawn starts. Ruth's kitchen, which ran on coffee and practicality, and the unspoken agreement that everyone who entered it was expected to be useful. The long days of a working cattle operation that communicated entirely in weather and fence line reports and the condition of the grass. I had stopped waiting to feel like a guest and started functioning like someone with a stake in the outcome. Because under the terms of that contract, I did. I was the first to see the smoke. North pasture. A black column rising too fast and too thick for anything natural. I did not think. I ran to the corral, saddled Sage without stopping for a second thought, and was riding before any of the hands had come out of the bunkhouse. 2 of them caught up behind me. I did not slow down for them. By the time I reached the north pasture, the grass fire was moving with the wind and moving fast. I organized the hands who arrived, wet burlap from the creek. Fire breaks dug in the dry ground ahead of the leading edge, the low land near the water as a last line. I knew this because my father had fought 2 grass fires in my lifetime, and I had watched and remembered everything. What I had not accounted for was the fence post that went up directly beside Sage. She spooked hard and threw me. I went down and rolled and came up in a crouch with fire on 3 sides, and the wind shifting in a way that closed the gap I had arrived through. 5 seconds of real fear. The specific kind where your body moves faster than your mind and makes decisions without consulting you. I went low, through the thickest smoke, found the gap I had marked when I first rode in, and pushed through it. I came out the other side singed and coughing, my hands scraped raw, my braid half burned away on the left side. But through. I got back to directing the fire break. The line held. Colt came over the ridge at a full gallop and pulled up at the smoke line. The fire was already contained. His hands were working the edge, and I was standing on the far side of the burned grass, covered in soot, directing the final break. He could not get to me. The smoke was still too thick, the ground still too hot. He sat on his horse and watched. Later, I would understand what those minutes cost him. A man who has already lost his brother to his own too careful timing, sitting on a horse watching his wife move through fire he cannot reach. When it was over and the smoke had thinned enough, he found me near the creek washing soot from my face. He crouched beside me without asking permission and took my hands, turning them to examine the burns and scrapes. His gloves were off. His hands were scarred in the particular way of a man who has worked hard and been in fights and survived both. He held mine carefully, the way you hold something you are afraid of damaging. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, I saw you go down when Sage threw you. I said, I got up. He said, I know. He was still looking at my hands. I know you did. I did not pull away. This was the first time I had simply allowed myself to sit with the fact that this man was afraid for me. Not of me. For me. It was a different thing entirely, and it settled into my chest in a way I was not prepared for. Then his voice went flat again. He said, "It was not an accident. Grass does not burn that fast without help. Tom, the foreman, found it in the ashes at the origin point, a short length of wire tied to a scorched wooden stake. Wrapped around the wire a strip of blue cloth, the specific blue of Ashford Syndicate work crews. Burned into the stake with a brand iron were 4 words. Next time the house." Colt looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said very quietly, to no one in particular, "All right, then." I did not ask what that meant. I had learned enough about Colt Hargrove in 2 weeks to know that all right then from him was not resignation. It was the sound of a man who has just clarified something for himself and is now prepared to act on the clarification. That evening he applied salve to my burned hands, Ruth's recipe, herbal and sharp-smelling and effective. He did it without speaking, seated across from me at the kitchen table, working carefully around the worst of the blisters. I watched his face while he worked. There was a kind of focused attention there that I recognized from the way he assessed fence lines and weather, but directed entirely at my hands. I said, "You are going to have to tell me what we are actually dealing with here." He said, "Not tonight." I said, "Soon." He said, "Soon." He tied off the last bandage and let my hands go and stood. At the door he stopped. He said, "You did well today. The fire break saved the north pasture." For Colt Hargrove, I was coming to understand. This was a considerable speech. That night I heard him in the hallway. He stopped outside my door longer than usual. I lay still and listened to the silence on the other side of that door and thought, a man who checks on someone in the night is not a man who feels nothing. He is a man who feels things he does not know how to say yet. His footsteps moved on. I thought, good. I can be patient. A cold rain kept everyone inside 3 weeks after I arrived at Hargrove Ranch. Colt found me in the front room cleaning my father's Springfield, which I had brought with me because it was my father's, and because a woman alone in the world needs to be prepared to be alone in the world. Colt stopped in the doorway and watched without speaking, which I had learned was how he assessed most things before deciding what to do with them. He said, "Where did you learn?" I said, "My father. Wolves, mostly. Some men." He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from me. He said, "Show me your grip. Show." I raised an eyebrow. I said, "I told you I know how." He said, "I want to see how well." So I showed him. He watched with the focused attention he brought to everything, and then he leaned forward and adjusted my left elbow, barely, just one finger, and stepped back. He said, "Again." Then, "You favor your right side when you anticipate recoil." I said, "Most people do." He said, "Most people do not need to hit what they are aiming at when it matters." We spent an hour on it. The ceiling was low and the light was bad, and the lesson required proximity, and I was acutely aware of him in the way you are aware of a fire in a small room, not uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. When we were done, I said, "Margaret." He set the rifle on the table. His hands went still for one beat. He said, "What about her?" I said, "You were married to her for 4 years. She left. You did not follow." He said, "No." I said, "Why not?" A long pause, the rain on the roof. Then he said, She was right about what she said. I carried something I could not put down. I did not know how to be worth staying for." He stood. "That is all there is to it." It was not all there was to it, I knew that. But I let it be enough for that day. I had noticed a pattern. 3 times in 3 weeks, Colt had ridden out in the dark hours, after midnight before dawn. He returned with mud on his boots and a new scrape somewhere on his hands, and nothing to say about where he had been. The first time I noted it. The second time I wondered. The third time I sat with the accumulation and understood that Colt Hargrove had a life running parallel to the one I could observe, and that the two lives were connected in ways he had not yet chosen to show me. I did not confront him. I watched. I waited. Ruth told me about James over the supper dishes that evening. She said his name the way people say the names of the dead they are still not finished grieving. James Hargrove, younger brother, who had followed Colt into Pinkerton detective work because he worshipped his older brother and Colt had not been able to say no to him, who had been framed 2 years ago on falsified evidence constructed by Victor Ashford's people, built carefully enough to survive initial legal challenge, who had died in territorial prison 6 months before the exoneration that came too late to matter. I said, and Ashford built the case. Ruth said, paid witnesses, bought a judge, every piece of it constructed. She set a dish in the drying rack. Colt proved it eventually, every piece. But James was already gone. I looked at the map on the kitchen wall. The Hargrove property in black, the Ashford acquisitions in red, the Hargrove land sitting directly between Ashford and the water rights the whole operation depended on. I said, Colt put himself in the way on purpose. Ruth said, bought the ranch 3 months after James died, set up right where Ashford needed to go, waited for Ashford to come to him. I said, so Ashford would have to make moves Colt could document. Ruth looked at me for a moment. She said, you are faster than I expected. I said, my father raised me to pay attention. She said, good. You are going to need it. That night I passed the study and the door was open and the lamp was burning, which was unusual. The photograph that had been face down on the desk for weeks was gone. In its place was a folded piece of paper with my name written on it in handwriting I had come to recognize from the maps. I opened it. Inside was a land survey, my father's property, marked with 3 red points and a date written in the corner. September 14th, 1881. 6 weeks before my father died. Someone had surveyed my father's land before the foreclosure, before the death, before any piece of this had begun. I carried the paper upstairs. I sat with it in the dark for a long time. I thought about the man at the tree line at my father's grave, about the timing of an offer that arrived 3 days after the burial, about a debt purchased and a marriage proposed by a man who had been watching my father's property for reasons he had not yet seen fit to explain to me. I thought, there is more to this than he has told me. I thought, I am going to find out what it is. I thought, and then we are going to have a very direct conversation. I went to town alone the following Thursday. Colt did not want me to go. We had our second real argument in the kitchen doorway, sharper than the first fence line disagreement, both of us saying more than we had quite intended. I went anyway because I needed information that people would not share with Colt Hargrove standing beside me, and because I was Elena Cross and I had never in my life allowed someone else's discomfort to override my own judgment. Harlan Creek was a real western town rendered in the full, honest detail of such places. The main street red with dust that settled on everything, including the residents. A church with a slightly crooked steeple. The mercantile smelling of tobacco and dried apples and bulk flour, and the particular sharpness of a working community. Women in calico and men in work-worn denim who had the look of people who had bet everything on a piece of land and intended to win. When I walked into the mercantile, the conversations did not stop. They adjusted. I was Mrs. Hargrove now. That name meant something specific in this valley, and not all of it was warmth. 2 women found sudden business on the far side of the store. A man tipped his hat but did not meet my eyes. A child was pulled gently away by its mother as I passed. I did not pretend not to notice. I shopped. I spoke clearly and pleasantly. I bought flour and coffee and a length of practical cotton and a small bottle of good lamp oil. I thanked people by name when I could find out their names. I did not apologize for who I was or who I had married. By the third stop, the post office, someone spoke to me directly, not because they had decided to trust me. Because curiosity in a small community is stronger than caution, given enough time and a sufficiently interesting subject. Sheriff Cal Briggs arranged to be at the post office counter when I arrived. He had the look of a man who has decided what he believes and has been living with it long enough that the decision shows in his posture. He was weathered and direct, and I liked him immediately, which I noted with some suspicion since I had not come to town to make friends. He said, "You are tougher than you look, Mrs. Hargrove. That is going to help you or get you killed out here, and I've not decided which yet." I said, "I have been told both before." He leaned on the counter. He said, "Ashford has bought 3 properties in 8 months. Not one of those sales was what I would call voluntary. 2 of the sellers left the territory. 1 is still here, and has not spoken above a whisper since." I said, "And Colt has been working against him alone." Cal said, "For 2 years. That is too long for one man, Mrs. Hargrove. Too long and too isolated." He looked at me directly. "I am not suggesting anything. I am telling you what I have observed." The ladies' auxiliary met at the church on Thursday afternoons. I went. This was not naive sociability. The women of a ranch community are the information network of that community, the ones who keep the households running and talk to the traveling merchants and notice when a neighbor's light goes dark 2 nights running. I did not ask for trust. I listened carefully. I remembered names and connected them to pieces of land I had seen on Colt's maps. I talked about my father and his property, because that was a story they could verify, and sympathy for the dead is more durable than sympathy for the living. By the end of the meeting, I had not made friends. But I had made an impression. And in a community this size, an impression is where everything starts. Clara Henderson told me, in the careful way of someone who has learned to be careful, that the Morrow family had not sold their property willingly. They had been given 48 hours to accept Ashford's offer or have their mortgage called in by the bank. They accepted the offer. The bank called it in anyway. I said, "Which bank holds most of the valley's mortgages?" Clara looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Territorial Savings and Land. The main branch is in the capital." I said, "And who owns Territorial Savings and Land?" She said, "Nobody will say it out loud." I said, "But everyone knows." She said, "Everyone knows." I came home to find Colt at the kitchen table with maps spread wide. He did not look up when I came in, but he said, "You went to the auxiliary." I said, "Ashford's people own your bank." He looked up. Something shifted in his expression. I sat across from him and told him everything Clara Henderson had said, and what Cal Briggs had told me, and what I had pieced together from the conversations at the auxiliary. He listened without interrupting, which I had learned was how he handled information worth having. Then I leaned over the map and pointed to the Northern Creek line. I said, "This is what he actually needs, not the individual ranches, the water access. If he controls this stretch of creek, he can deny water rights to every property downstream. Every ranch in the Southern Valley becomes worthless or dependent on him. That is the whole plan." Colt said, "The Morrow property completed the northern access. He has it now." I said, "Then we need to stop him before he gets yours." I traced a section of the map with my finger, a stretch along the creek marked in handwriting older than the rest of the annotations. I said, "Is this James's land?" His hand, resting beside the map, went very still. I put my hand over his. Not a gesture of romance. The way you place your hand on the arm of someone carrying something they should not have to carry alone. I was not pretending I could fix what had happened to James Hargrove. I was refusing to let Colt stand in that particular place without company. He looked down at my hand on his. He did not move it. He did not speak. After a long moment, he turned his hand under mine and held it once, then released it and pointed at the map. He said, "The bank documentation. If we can pull the ownership records from before Ashford restructured the holding company 3 years ago, we can prove the mortgage manipulation was coordinated, not incidental. I said, I know someone at the land office who owes my father a favor he never got the chance to repay. We worked until past midnight. Side by side, no distance between us anymore. At some point, Ruth appeared with coffee and looked at the two of us bent over the maps together and made a small sound that might have been satisfaction and went back to bed without saying a word. Victor Ashford came on a Tuesday morning in a polished coach with outriders and a driver and the self-possession of a man who has never had to knock on a door because doors have always been opened for him. He was exactly what I had expected from the letters and the rumors. Expensive suit, expensive manners, the kind of handsome that comes from never having gone hungry. He smiled at me from the porch steps with precisely calibrated warmth, and I felt, with complete clarity, that I was looking at something that had learned to wear a human face and worn it long enough to believe it. Colt was out on the North Range. Ruth was at the back of the house. Only I was at the door. Ashford said, "Mrs. Hargrove, I hope I am not calling at an inconvenient time." I said, "You are. Come in. Come." He sat at my kitchen table and drank the tea I set in front of him, and complimented the house and the view and asked after the cattle operation with the interested attention of a man who already knew every answer. He did not make a single explicit threat. He did not say anything that could be quoted against him. He talked about the valley's potential and the territory's future and the benefits of coordinated development over isolated individual operations. When he stood to leave, he paused at the table and set a small bundle down. Wildflowers tied with twine. He said, "For the house." My men gathered them, riding in. Beautiful country out toward the western fence line. He left. I looked at the flowers, western fence line. Hargrove's most remote and least patrolled boundary. I picked up the bouquet and carried it to Ruth, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway. Ruth looked at it. She said, "He has been watching the western property." I said, "He wanted me to know that." She said, "Without saying anything you could use against him." I said, "Yes." Ruth said, "He is smarter than Fletcher was." Fletcher had been a previous syndicate man, she explained, less subtle. Ashford is more dangerous because he is patient. I said, "Then we will need to be more patient." Colt came home at mid-afternoon and I told him everything. Every word, every pause, the flowers, the western fence line. He listened without moving. Then he picked up the bouquet, walked outside, and burned it in the yard. He stood there until it was ash. When he came back inside, his face was the controlled blank I had learned to read as the outer surface of something much less controlled underneath. He sat at the table and looked at his hands for a moment. He said, "How long do you think they have been watching the western line?" I said, "Long enough to know your patrol pattern, which means we change it." He looked at me. I said, "We." He said, "Elena." I said, "Yes, we. This is my ranch too under the terms of our contract, and I am done being an observer." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you some things." I said, "Yes, you do." He told me about James. Not everything, not yet, but enough. That Ashford had built the case, that James had died in prison, that Colt had come to Blackwater Valley not simply to ranch, but to position himself where Ashford would eventually have to come to him, where every move Ashford made against the valley's ranchers could be documented by someone with the legal training to know exactly which documents mattered. He said, "I needed a reason to be here that looked like legitimate ranching. A working ranch in a strategic location. A wife made the operation credible." I said, "And I was available and desperate." He said, "You were available. I would not have approached you if you had not been someone worth approaching." I said, "That is almost a compliment." He said, "I mean it plainly." As I said, "I know you do. That is the almost..." He looked at me for a long moment. Then something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. He said, "There is more I need to tell you, but not tonight." I said, "Soon." He said, "Soon." That night, I passed the study and saw that the face-down photograph was gone from the desk entirely. In its place, face up against the lamp base, was a new photograph. The same young man I had seen before, James by the handwriting on the back, but a different image. He was standing beside a horse, laughing at something outside the frame, and the laugh had reached his eyes in a way that made the photograph almost unbearable to look at. Colt had chosen to look at him tonight. I went to my room and lay in the dark and thought about what it costs a person to turn a photograph face up after keeping it face down for months. What decision that represents. What it means to finally be willing to see the face of someone you have not yet forgiven yourself for losing. At 2 in the morning, I heard him ride out. South, I thought. The same direction as before. I went to the window and watched him go and made a decision of my own. Tomorrow, we would have the rest of the conversation. Cal Briggs rode in at midnight, 11 days later. 2 Alliance ranchers hit simultaneously. Henry Morrow's rebuilt fence line cut in 4 places. The Hendersons' south pasture gate opened and 30 heads scattered across the valley road. Not random, coordinated. The kind of operation that requires planning and enough men to execute 2 targets at the same time. Colt was saddled before Cal finished the second sentence. I was mounted before Colt reached the corral. He took one look at me and did not waste time arguing. We rode out together with 4 ranch hands behind us, into the dark and the cold and the large western silence. And I was not afraid of any of it. I was something else entirely, something I had not felt since before my father died. Present, necessary, part of something that mattered. The ambush came at the creek crossing, which in retrospect was predictable. Ashford's men had chosen the one point of the road that offered cover on both sides and no clear retreat. There were 4 of them. The fight was short and ugly and nothing like the stories people tell about such things. It was noise and cold mud and confusion and people making fast, bad decisions in the dark. Colt moved through it with the terrible efficiency of someone who has done this before and does not enjoy it and does not stop doing it either. I fired twice. Hit once, a shoulder shot, not a kill, but enough. The Ashford men pulled back. When the noise stopped, everyone on our side was upright. Colt had a wound on his upper arm, a graze from a bullet that had come close enough to matter. He did not mention it. I noticed it when he reached across me for the reins, and his sleeve pulled back in the lamplight at the Henderson gate. I said, "You are bleeding." He said, "It is not serious." I said, "It is serious enough to bandage. Come home." Ruth took one look at his arm and pointed at the kitchen table with the authority of a woman who has bandaged more injuries than she has bothered to count. Colt sat. I assisted because Ruth's hands were less steady than they had once been by lamplight, and because nobody had to ask me to. I cut away his sleeve. The wound was a graze, not deep, but it had bled well and needed cleaning and closing. I worked by lamplight. His back was a map of old damage. Scars layered on scars, some from fights, some from falls, some that had been properly stitched and some that had not. I worked without comment until my fingers passed over one mark near his left shoulder blade that was different from the others. Deliberate. A burn scar, made with something small and applied with care. I said quietly, "That one is different from the others." A long pause. He said, "I made it myself." I did not ask. I continued working. My hands were steady. He said, "After James died, I needed somewhere to put what I was carrying, the grief, the fact that I was still standing, and he was not. I needed it to be somewhere I could at least see it." I tied off the bandage. I did not let go of his arm immediately. I said, "You do not have to carry it on your skin." He said, "I know that now. It took me longer than it should have." I let go of his arm. He turned on the stool to face me, and for the first time in our marriage there was nothing between us. No careful management, no negotiated distance. Just the lamplight and the truth. He said, "There is something else I have not told you." I said, "I know." He said, When I came to Blackwater Valley, I needed land in a specific location. I needed a reason to be here that Ashford would not look behind. A wife who appeared to be simply a wife. He looked at his hands. You were available and you needed help and the situation aligned. I said, you are telling me I was a piece of your plan. He said, you were a piece of my plan at the beginning. That is the truth, and I am telling it to you plainly because you deserve plainly. The words sat between us. I had been waiting for this. Not these exact words, but something like them, since I had found that land survey with my father's property marked in red with a date before his death. I said, that is not all of it. He said, no. I said, the rest, when you are ready. I stood, walked to the door, stopped with my hand on the frame. He said, Elena. I stopped. He said, I have not been inside my own life in 3 years, going through the motions of it, yes, but not actually present in it. He paused. I notice that I am present now. I notice that has something to do with you. I do not know what to do with that yet, but I wanted you to know I have noticed it. I stood in the doorway for a moment, then I said, that is the most you have said to me at one time. He said, yes. I said, it was enough. I went outside into the cold night and the enormous western sky and stood there for a while. The valley was dark and very quiet. The mountains were shapes against the stars. When I came back inside an hour later and went upstairs, his boots were already in the hall. He was sitting on the floor outside my door, his back against the wall, his head tipped back. Not asleep, just there. I stopped and looked at him. He looked up at me. He said, I did not know where else to go. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. I sat down on the floor beside him, my back against the opposite wall. We sat there in the hallway in the dark, not touching, not speaking. The house settled around us. The night moved slowly past. At some point before dawn, his breathing evened and deepened, and he slept, actually slept, sitting on the floor of his own hallway. I stayed awake and watched over him and thought, this is the moment. Not the contract, not the ceremony. This is the moment I stopped counting this as a business arrangement and started counting it as something I intended to keep. The plan to expose Ashford was Colt's architecture, built over 2 years of night rides and documented evidence and the patient legal precision of a former Pinkerton man who knew exactly which pieces of paper would matter in front of which judge. But the plan needed infrastructure. It needed witnesses who could not be bought. It needed a network of information that moved faster than Ashford's money. It needed people who would stand up in public and say what they knew. That was my part. Over the following 2 weeks, I worked the alliance Colt had been building quietly, and I expanded it into something louder. I rode to the Henderson place and the Patterson spread and 3 other ranches where families had been watching Ashford's methods with growing fear and no clear sense that resistance was possible. I sat in kitchens and talked plainly about what we knew and what we were planning and what it would require. I said, at every table, we are doing this together or we are not doing it at all. If anyone is not willing to stand publicly as a witness, tell me now, because I need to know who I can count on. Some said no. I respected that. Most said yes. The evening before we moved, Colt and I sat on the porch in the early dark. The valley was quiet. The stars were the particular extravagance of the western sky, the kind that requires 40 miles of darkness in every direction to achieve. Colt was looking at something I could not see. I knew the look. He went somewhere when he thought about James, not grief exactly anymore, something more settled. A man making a kind of peace, slowly, with something he could not change. I said, after this, what do you want? He turned to look at me. I said, not the plan, not Ashford, after, when it is done. I looked out at the valley. I want to put apple trees along the eastern fence line. The soil is right for it, and there is enough creek runoff for the water. I want to see them in 5 years when they are bearing. I paused. I want you to be here when that happens. He was very still. I said, that is not a dramatic declaration. I know it is apple trees. But I think that is what I'm actually fighting for. Not the land in the contract. The land I can imagine. He reached over without looking at me and took my hand. He held it. He did not let go. He said, apple trees. I said, and whatever else comes after. He said, that sounds like a long time. I said, yes, it does. Yes, it... We sat there in the dark with our hands linked and the whole valley spread before us, and it was the most honest moment our marriage had produced. The betrayal came from Dan Fielding. He was a good man, and I want to be clear about that. He had a wife and 3 children and a mortgage that Ashford held, and he had been trying to balance the terror of Ashford's reach against the hope of our alliance, and in the end the terror won. He sent word to Ashford the night before we moved, not out of malice, out of the desperation of a man who could not afford to lose. Ashford did not wait. He came to the ranch with 8 armed men at mid-morning, riding through the gate with the easy ownership of someone who considers arrival to be equivalent to possession. Colt was at the north fence with Tom, 2 miles out. Cal Briggs was 30 minutes away. The hands were scattered across the property. I was in the house with Ruth. I got my father's Springfield from the rack, checked the load, took my position at the front of the house where I could be seen clearly from the yard. Ruth went to the side window without being asked. She had a shotgun that she handled with the calm competence of a woman who has been dealing with problems her whole life and has never had the luxury of waiting for someone else to solve them. Ashford stopped his horse 20 feet from the porch steps. He said pleasantly, "Mrs. Hargrove, is your husband at home?" I said, "He is not, which means you are dealing with me." He said, "I would like to discuss the property." I said, "The property is not for discussion." He said, "Everything is open to discussion with the right leverage, Mrs. Hargrove." I said, "Mr. Ashford, you are on my land, uninvited, with 8 armed men, and you are standing within range of a woman who has been shooting wolves since she was 12 years old. I would suggest you reconsider the word leverage." He looked at me for a long time. I kept the rifle steady. My hands did not shake. I was thinking about my father, who had tried to be reasonable with this man's people for 6 months, and about what that reasonableness had cost him. Ashford said, "You are very like your father." Something went cold in my chest. I said, "What did you say?" He said, "Edmund Cross. Good man, stubborn in exactly this way." His voice was pleasant and even. "He would not be reasoned with either." I said, "Get off my land." Colt came over the ridge at a dead run. He took in the scene in the time it takes to blink. 8 armed men in his yard, his wife on the porch with a rifle, Ashford on his horse. His face did something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not rage, not panic. The specific expression of a man who sees the thing he cannot afford to lose and understands with complete clarity what he will do to protect it. Cal Briggs rode in behind him with his deputy and a warrant drawn up on 2 years of documented evidence. The arrest was quiet, which disappointed some of the watching ranch hands who had been hoping for something more dramatic. Ashford was led away, still smiling, the way some men smile until the cell door closes and they hear the lock. Colt crossed the yard and looked up at me on the porch. I still had the rifle. He said, "You held the house." I said, "Someone had to." He said, "Elena." I said, "Do not make a speech about it." He said, "I was not going to make a speech." He put one hand on the porch railing. "I was going to say that watching you stand on that porch telling Ashford you would shoot his horse first was the finest thing I have seen in my adult life." I laughed. Actually laughed, out loud, which surprised us both. He smiled. The full version, unreserved, the one I suspected he used to have before James died and had been keeping in storage since. I thought, there you are. There is the man underneath all of it. Dan Fielding came to the house the morning after the arrest. He stood at the door with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground and said what he had done and why, and that he was sorry, and that he would understand if we wanted nothing more to do with him. I opened the door wider. I said, "Come in. We need to talk about what you know." Colt, sitting at the kitchen table, said nothing. He watched me handle it and said nothing. After Fielding had gone, Colt said, "You did not wait to be angry." I said, "I am angry. I am also practical. He has information we need and he is willing to give it, and I will be angry at him properly once Ashford is finished." Colt said, "That is very cold-blooded." I said, "I am a very cold-blooded woman when the situation calls for it." He said, "I noticed that." The legal case needed one more piece. Ashford's lawyers had arrived from the capital within 48 hours, expensive and competent, and while Colt's 2 years of documentation were formidable, there was a gap in the timeline of James's frame-up that needed a witness who had been present. Cal told us this at the kitchen table. He said, "I have been looking for that witness for 2 years. Someone who was there when the evidence was constructed. Someone Ashford could not buy or threaten into silence because they had already run far enough to be safe." Colt said nothing. I looked at him. He was looking at the table. Margaret Hargrove arrived in Harlan Creek on a Thursday. She was not what I had constructed in my imagination. Less fragile, more self-possessed. She had the bearing of someone who had made a choice she was not proud of, and had spent 3 years making an honest accounting of it. She went to Cal's office first. Then Cal sent word. We rode in together, Colt and I, and met her in the sheriff's office with 2 lamps burning, and the late afternoon light coming through the window at a long angle. She was direct. She said she had seen documents in Colt's study 3 years ago that she had not understood at the time. She said she had left partly because she was afraid of what those documents implied, and partly for other reasons she owned without excuses. She said she had spent 3 years preparing to say what she knew, and had arrived now because the arrest meant it would finally matter. She looked at me. She said, "I should have stayed." I said, "You are here now." She said, "Too late for James." I said, "In time for everything else." Her testimony filled the gap. Combined with Colt's documentation and the bank records Cal had pulled, it was enough for a federal charge. Colt and I rode home in the late afternoon. The valley was golden and long-shadowed. We did not speak for a mile. Then Colt said, "You did not ask me anything about her." I said, "I asked you one thing that mattered on the first night I arrived. I never got an answer. I would like it now." He knew what I meant. I had watched his face the first time I asked, and I had seen him make the decision not to answer, and I had waited ever since. He looked at the road ahead. He said, "I had been watching your father's property for 3 months before he died. I knew Ashford was applying pressure. I thought I had more time before it escalated to something I could not stop." His voice was even and controlled in the way of someone who has rehearsed the saying of something difficult many times in private. He died on a Wednesday. I arrived Thursday morning. I said, "You were too late." He said, "Yes." I said, "And then you offered to marry me." He said, "I owed him something I could not pay him. I thought if I could at least make certain you did not lose the land on top of losing him." He paused. "That is not all it is now. I need you to know that clearly." I said, "I know that." He said, "How?" I said, "Because you held my hands after the fire, and you sat on the floor outside my door all night, and you looked at Ashford on that porch the way a man looks at something standing between him and the only thing he has left." I looked at him. "I know, Colt." He reached over and took my hand on the reins. He held it for the rest of the ride home through the long golden light and the turning of the valley toward evening, and did not let go until we reached the gate. Spring came to Blackwater Valley. in the way of springs in that country, sudden and extravagant, as if the land had been holding its breath through the long winter and finally allowed itself to exhale. The grass went green almost overnight. The creek ran full and clear. Wildflowers appeared in the low ground along the eastern fence line in colors I had not seen in the November when I arrived. Colt took me to the room he had kept locked since buying the ranch. He opened it without ceremony. It was dusty and simple, and containing only a bed frame and a window facing east. He had set this room aside for James when he purchased the property, intending it as the beginning of a new life for his brother after the legal battle concluded. James had never seen it. We cleaned it together. We did not hurry. Colt talked about James while we worked. Real stories, the small kind, the ones that are funny and specific and reveal the particular shape of a person rather than the outline. The time James burned supper for an entire bunkhouse because he was reading and forgot the stove. The horse James named after a senator because he said it had the same stubborn dignity and worse judgment. The way James laughed at his own jokes before he reached the punchline, which meant you always knew the punchline was coming, but laughed anyway because his anticipation was funnier than the joke. I listened. I let the stories fill the room. I said, "He sounds like someone I know." Colt said, "Do not push it." But the corner of his mouth moved. We rode to the cemetery on a morning in early April. Both graves, my father's stone and the marker Colt had placed for James when the body was returned from the prison. We stood between them in the early light, the valley still cool, the mountains clear and close-looking, the way they get before a weather change. Colt spoke to me rather than to the graves. That was how I knew it was real. He said, "Your father. I watched his property for 3 months and I let it go too long. I was building a case, and I was careful, and I was right about the law, and I was wrong about the man. He needed someone to step in before it became evidence, and I did not step in." He looked at me. "I am telling you so you know that I know what I cost you, by being too careful and arriving too late." I looked at my father's stone for a moment. I thought about the night I buried him alone in the cold mud with a borrowed shovel and a hawk overhead. I thought about the man at the tree line on the gray horse watching, because he felt he owed something to a man he had failed. I said, "He would have liked you." He respected people who were trying to do the right thing even when they got it wrong. He said the trying was the character, and the getting it right was just luck. Colt said nothing, but something released in his face. A tension I had seen there so long I had stopped registering it as tension. The expression of a man who has been holding a verdict against himself and has just heard a different ruling from someone with authority to give it. I took his arm. We stood there until the light shifted, and we were ready to leave. Ruth met us on the porch with coffee and the expression of someone who has been watching a story develop from the beginning and is privately satisfied with its direction. She said, "Well, about time." "Well," Colt said, "about time for what?" She said, "Both of you, I am not going to say it out loud. You are grown adults." She handed us our cups and went back inside to start breakfast. I set my cup at the left side of the kitchen table. Colt sat across from me. Ruth took her place at the end. The ranch began its morning around us, hands in the yard, Tom calling the day's work assignments, the horses moving in the corral with the particular restlessness of animals who know the weather is about to turn. This was the moment I marked, not the ceremony in the judge's front room, not the night in the hallway. This ordinary morning, this table, this cup of coffee in a kitchen that smelled of beeswax and bread, and the particular warmth of a house that has people in it who intend to stay. This was where our marriage actually began. The Ashford case was resolved at the Territorial Assembly 2 months later. Margaret's testimony and Colt's documentation together were more than enough. Victor Ashford was convicted on 7 counts of fraud, land manipulation, and conspiracy. The Ashford Land Syndicate was dissolved by federal order. The properties acquired through manipulation were unwound where possible and compensated where they could not be returned. Ashford went to prison. He did not return to the territory. Dan Fielding came to us a week after the verdict. He stood in our yard and said he understood if the alliance was finished for him. He said he would live with what he had done regardless. I said, "The alliance is not finished for anyone who is willing to stand in it going forward. What you did is between you and your conscience. We have work to do, and I would rather do it with you than without you." He looked at Colt. Colt said, "What she said." Fielding nodded. He stayed. The Blackwater Valley Ranchers Association formalized its structure that autumn. 12-member families. Cal Briggs as legal representative, Henry Morrow as vice president, Eleanor Hargrove as secretary and record keeper, a role that suited me entirely since I'd been keeping records since the beginning and had gotten very good at knowing which things to write down and which things to remember differently. The apple trees went in along the eastern fence line in the second week of April. 6 trees, a variety Ruth had recommended for the soil and the climate, small and bare-branched, and requiring a considerable act of faith to look at and see anything resembling a future harvest. Colt helped me plant them. He was not a sentimental man, and he did not make speeches about what they represented. He dug and tamped and watered alongside me. And when we were done, he stood back and looked at the row of small, bare trees against the fence line in the afternoon light. He said, "They are going to need 5 years." I said, "I know." He said, "I will be here." I said, "I know that too." That evening we sat on the porch as we had taken to doing, watching the valley go golden and then purple and then dark. The stars came out in their extravagant western way. Ruth's lamp was visible through the kitchen window. Somewhere out in the pasture, a horse called once and was answered. Colt said, "Tom wants to expand the north herd. He thinks we can run an extra 200 head if we rotate the south pasture through the summer." I said, "That is not romantic." He said, "No." I said, "Good. I like it better that way." He put his arm around my shoulders and I leaned against him and felt his heartbeat, steady and slow, the heartbeat of a man who is finally, actually at rest. I thought about the girl who had dug a grave alone in November mud and looked up to find a stranger watching from the tree line. I thought about the contract she had signed and the life she had not been able to imagine from that distance. I thought she was braver than she knew. She had no idea what she was walking into. Good thing. Colt said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking about the girl who signed the contract." He said, "What about her?" I said, "She thought she was out of choices. She was wrong. She had exactly one choice, and she made it, and it was the right one." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "She was not the only one who made it." I looked at him. He said, "I sent that lawyer to your door because the situation aligned. Because I needed a wife and you needed help and the numbers matched." He looked at the valley. "I stayed because I wanted to. That is different. I want you to know I know the difference." I said, "Colt Hargrove, that might be the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." He said, "Do not tell anyone. It will ruin my reputation." I laughed. He laughed. The sound of it went out over the dark valley, and the apple trees along the eastern fence line, and the mountains beyond, and the enormous western sky above all of it. And it sounded like something that intended to stay. A letter. Elena writing to Margaret, who has settled in a town 2 valleys east, and has become, against the expectations of everyone including themselves, a genuine friend. Dear Margaret, the apple trees bore this autumn. First real harvest, not enough to matter commercially, enough to matter in every other way that counts. Ruth made 4 pies and declared the yield insufficient and ate 2 slices herself, which I took as high praise. Colt stood at the kitchen counter and ate a piece without sitting down and said nothing. From Colt, silence about food means complete approval. I have learned to read the language. Cal won his bid for district judge. He is exactly as terrible at the paperwork as you would expect, and exactly as good at the actual judging. He sent a very short letter of thanks when the Ashford verdict was upheld on final appeal. The letter said, "We did good work. I thought you should know I know that." That was the whole letter. It is the most Cal thing I have ever read. The association has 12 families now. We meet every first Thursday at the church hall. I keep the minutes, which means I am the person who decides what goes on record and what gets quietly omitted, which is a considerable amount of power and one I try to use responsibly. Henry Morrow proposed last month that we formalize an emergency fund for families facing predatory mortgage pressure. It passed unanimously. We are building something that will outlast all of us, which is the only kind of building worth doing. James William Hargrove is 4 years old. He has his father's stubbornness and his uncle's laugh, the one that gets ahead of the punchline and gives the whole joke away before it lands. He follows Colt everywhere, a devoted shadow in small boots, and Colt has infinite patience for this particular student. I watch them in the yard together sometimes, and I think, this is what James would have wanted. Not the revenge, not the victory over Ashford. This, a child named for him learning the shape of the world from the brother who loved him. Colt sleeps. I want you to understand what I mean when I say that, since you knew him in the years when he did not. He sleeps the way people sleep when they have set something down that they were never meant to carry alone. He told me once that he started sleeping the night he sat down on the floor outside my bedroom door because he did not know where else to go. I told him that was just exhaustion. He said maybe. His voice said probably not. He is still not a man of many words. He still checks the rifle before bed and the horses first thing in the morning. He still goes still sometimes, looking at something only he can see. I have learned to read the difference between the stillness that needs interrupting and the stillness that needs leaving alone. We have built a whole language between us of the things that do not need to be said out loud. And I think that is the truest kind of marriage. Not the ceremony, the language. I want to say something to you that I have been thinking about since the day you arrived in Cal's office and gave us what we needed to finish this. You said you should have stayed. I have thought about that many times. I think you stayed as long as you could and left when you could not and came back when it mattered. That is not a failure. That is a person doing the best they could with what they had at the time. I know something about that. Ask your husband what you are fighting for, not what you are fighting against. The answer to that question is the only one that actually matters in the long run. Then plant something you want to see in 5 years. It helps more than I can explain in a letter. Write when you can. Ruth wants to know if you are eating properly. I told her that is not an appropriate question to put in a letter to a grown woman. She told me to put it in anyway. With affection, Eleanor Hargrove, Blackwater Valley, October 1886. She folded the letter and sealed it and set it by the door for the morning post. Outside, the valley was performing its evening routine, the light going gold and long, and then the mountains going purple, and then the first stars arriving one at a time until the whole sky was committed. She could hear Colt in the yard with James explaining something about the horses in the low, patient voice he used for things that mattered. Then James's laugh ahead of the punchline, and then Colt's answering laugh, and then quiet. She stood in the doorway and listened to that quiet, and thought about the girl in the November mud with the borrowed shovel, and the hawk overhead and the $3.18 in her coat pocket and the man watching from the tree line. She thought, you did not know what you were walking into. She thought, good thing. If you had known, you might have been sensible about it. She thought, sensible would have been the worst mistake you ever made. She went outside to join her family. The stars were fully out over Blackwater Valley. The apple trees along the eastern fence line were already thinking about spring, the way growing things always are, already reaching for the next season before the current one has finished. She crossed the yard to where her husband stood with their son in the last of the evening light. Colt looked at her over James's head. That look. The one she had first seen at her father's grave across the November distance, when she did not yet know his name or why he was there, or what any of it would become. He said, come see. He found the gray mare's new foal. She went to see. James grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the barn with the urgent conviction of a 4-year-old who believes every discovery is the most important one that has ever occurred. She let herself be pulled. Behind them, the stars came all the way out over Blackwater Valley, over the ranch and the apple trees and the creek running clear through the dark, over all the land they had fought for and built on and intended to keep. The mountains stood as they always stood. The valley breathed its slow evening breath. Inside the barn, in the lamplight, the foal stood on uncertain legs beside its mother, and James Hargrove laughed his uncle's laugh, ahead of the punchline. And Colt Hargrove put his arm around his wife's shoulders and held on. And that, as my father used to say, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would like to share the meaning and moral lessons of this powerful Western story. On the surface, it is a tale of land disputes, danger, revenge, and survival in a harsh valley. But underneath all of that, it is really a story about grief, redemption, courage, trust, and the kind of love that is built not on sweet words, but on sacrifice, patience, and shared struggle. The first important meaning of the story is that pain does not have to be the end of a person's life. Elena begins the story in loneliness and loss. She buries her father alone, surrounded not by comfort, but by silence and abandonment. Colt, in his own way, is also buried long before the story begins. He is alive, but emotionally trapped by guilt, by the death of his brother, and by the darkness he carries inside himself. Both of them are wounded people. Yet the story shows us that broken people are not finished people. Suffering may shape them, but it does not have to destroy them. That is one of the deepest truths in the story. The second lesson is that real love is proven through actions, not appearances. This is not a romance that begins with softness, poetry, or easy affection. It begins with a contract, with necessity, with suspicion, and with silence. But slowly, what begins as an arrangement becomes something honest and lasting. Why? Because Colt protects Elena without trying to control her soul. Elena sees Colt's wounds without turning away from them. They choose each other again and again through small acts. Making coffee, tending burns, sitting awake in the hallway, riding into danger together, and building a future side by side. The story teaches us that true love is not just passion. True love is presence. It is loyalty. It is staying, when staying matters. Another major lesson is that justice requires courage, but also patience. Colt wants to destroy Ashford, and he has every personal reason to do so. Yet the story does not glorify blind revenge. Instead, it shows that lasting justice is built through evidence, endurance, strategy, and collective action. Colt's pain gives him motive, but it is Elena who helps turn that motive into something larger and wiser. Together they move from private anger to public justice. That matters. The story reminds us that anger alone may burn hot, but wisdom is what wins the long fight. The story also teaches us that no one defeats evil alone. At first, both Elena and Colt stand in isolation. Elena buries her father alone. Colt carries his grief alone. The valley itself is divided by fear. But over time, the story reveals that survival and justice come through community. Ranchers speak up. Women share information. Witnesses come forward. Even forgiveness, in some cases, becomes part of rebuilding what was broken. This is a very important moral point. When good people stay silent and separate, corruption grows stronger. But when ordinary people stand together, even powerful evil can be brought down. There is also a beautiful lesson about the future. One of the most memorable symbols in the story is the apple trees Elena wants to plant along the eastern fence line. Those trees are more than trees. They represent hope. They represent a life beyond survival. They represent the courage to believe in something that will take years to bear fruit. That, to me, is one of the story's greatest messages. Healing begins when people stop asking only, "How do I survive today?" and start asking, "What am I building for tomorrow?" Revenge looks backward. Love and faith plant orchards. Finally, the story teaches us that redemption is possible. Colt cannot undo the past. He cannot save James. He cannot return Elena's father. He cannot erase his failures. But he can tell the truth, protect what remains, and become a better man in the life he still has. Elena, too, transforms from a woman cornered by loss into a woman of strength, leadership, and vision. Their marriage becomes meaningful, not because it began perfectly, but because they chose to